Добрый день.
Good afternoon. Today we have published the draft monetary policy guidelines for 2021 to 2023. Pursuant to the requirements of the federal law on the Bank of Russia, the draft has been submitted to the President and the government for them to provide their comments, with the final version of the draft will be sent to the State Duma at the end of September. The guidelines stipulate our approach to monetary policy, and in this document, we also give our outlook for the future and our opinion as to how we are planning to achieve our inflation target with account of the current changes in the Russian and global economic and the financial system. This year, we have been observing drastic changes. The coronavirus pandemic has entailed a development of events that totally differs from the baseline scenario we presented in the guidelines last year. However, despite all the changes in the economic conditions, the Bank of Russia's monetary policy goals and principle remain unchanged. We are consistently pursuing inflation targeting policy aimed at keeping annual inflation close to 4% on a continuous basis. Over the last 3 years, from August 2017 to August 2020, annual inflation averaged 3.4%. This year's experience has proved that our policy is efficient during both calm and turbulent periods. Beginning from March or even mid-February, the situation in the economy and financial markets started to rapidly deviate from the baseline scenario. Unprecedented measures taken by the government authorities worldwide to limit the spread of the coronavirus infection entailed an equally unprecedented slump in economic activity in the first half of the year. A drastic rise in uncertainty triggered a surge in volatility in financial markets. In the oil market, these negative factors were amplified by expanding supply after the OPEC Plus arrangement had expired in March. In these rather challenging conditions, the Bank of Russia managed to pursue counter-cyclical policy in contrast to the crises of 2008-09. and 14-15. The acceleration of price growth in spring, induced by the weakening of the ruble and the temporary rise in demand for basic goods, did not last long and was not as pronounced as during the previous crisis periods. No less importantly, inflation expectations also increased rather moderately. As a result, it was already in April that we were able to resume the key rate reduction and shift to accommodative monetary policy, which facilitates economic recovery and helps stabilize inflation at the target close to 4%. We made our decision so that the effect would manifest itself after main restrictive anti-coronavirus measures are lifted, and people and businesses start to return to their normal life. In contrast to fiscal policy, the effect of monetary policy on the economy and inflation has significant time lags. It takes from 3 to 6 quarters for the Bank of Russia's decision on a key rate change to fully transmit into decisions on consumption, investment, saving, and lending made by households, businesses, and banks. This is why, during the acute phase of the coronavirus pandemic in spring and summer, the stabilization measures implemented by the government to support households and businesses and the regulatory easing by the Bank of Russia were utmost important. Now, monetary policy will compensate for the gradual termination of these measures. And further on, the impact of the decisions on the key rate reduction will increase, manifesting itself in the coming months and quarters. Taking into account the above-mentioned monetary policy lags, we will observe the effects on monetary conditions stemming not only from this year's monetary easing, but also from the key rate cuts in 2019. Let me remind you that since the beginning of the year, the decrease in the key rate totaled 200 basis points, and from June 2019, 350 basis points. Overall, the key rate was cut from 7.75 to 4.25% per annum. It is definitely necessary to stress once again the role of the fiscal rule mechanism, which has proved to be efficient as an automatic stabilizer, helping smooth out the consequences of fluctuations in the global hydrocarbon market for the economy. The coordination of the governments and the Bank of Russia's efforts and the understanding of the capacities and limits of each other's instruments are an essential prerequisite for the successful implementation of macroeconomic policy, driving the economy back to the sustainable growth path and its potential and maintaining inflation at the target. Unfortunately, this year's events not only materially complicated the conditions for pursuing monetary policy in 2020, but also significantly increased uncertainty over economic developments in the coming years. Moreover, this uncertainty is related to both aggregate demand trends and the aftermath of the pandemic for supply-side factors determining the potential of both the Russian and global economies. In these circumstances, we have developed more forecast scenarios for the guidelines. I would like to point out that if in the previous years the price of oil was the key assumption, today the situation has changed. On the one hand, owing to the policy pursued by the government amid the fiscal rule and the Bank of Russia, inflation targeting and a floating exchange rate, the economy's dependence on oil has decreased. During the acute stage of the pandemic, we saw how these instruments enable us to soften the external shock that is not necessarily related to oil. On the other hand, the nature of this uncertainty also differs from the previous years. Uncertainty regarding demand is associated with possible shifts in both consumers' behavior and in companies' investment demand due to financial losses they have faced and a less predictable future. Uncertainty about the economic potential and supply-side factors is rooted in changes in production costs, a decrease in output caused by the new sanitary and epidemiological rules, adjustments in production chains needed to be secured against possible new restrictions, and a rise in debt burden. Another factor that may adversely affect the global economy's potential is trade tensions that have been increasing again lately after a certain pause. The forecast scenarios analyzed in the guidelines reflect this two-way nature of the uncertainty. They vary in the assumptions with respect to the dynamics of recovery of aggregate demand and with respect to shifts in the path of potential GDP. We have 4 scenarios, a baseline, and 3 alternatives. The baseline scenario of the Bank of Russia's forecast was presented in July. In the guidelines, we have extended it to 2023. It is based on a relatively rapid recovery of private demand, budget consolidation with the federal budget returning to the fiscal rule parameters in 2022, and quite moderate consequences of the pandemic for the potential. The baseline scenario presumes that an accommodative monetary policy will likely remain in place in 2021, with a gradual return to a neutral monetary policy in the second half of the forecast period as inflation stabilizes at the target level. The disinflationary scenario can materialize if the pandemic continues and restrictive measures remain in place. It presumes a significantly slower recovery of demand, income and investment activity with a steady decline in propensity to consume and longer monetary policy transmission lags. The worsening of economic expectations can cause a new surge of volatility in financial markets. However, after that, a long period of contained demand will cause inflation to sustainably deviate downwards from the target, which will require an even longer and perhaps more pronounced accommodative monetary policy to bring inflation back to the target. The pro-inflationary scenario is based on the dynamics of demand similar to the forecast in the baseline scenario. However, the drop of the economic's potential here is significant. It also contains a demonstrative assumption that budget consolidation takes longer and is extended until 2023. In these circumstances, the economy returns to this lower potential already in 2021 and even slightly exceeds it. To keep inflation at the target level of 4%, the Bank of Russia might need to temporarily shift to a moderately tight monetary policy with a subsequent return to a neutral policy by the end of the forecast period. And finally, the risk scenario combines a weak recovery of demand and a significant drop of potential. This scenario is additionally worsened by a likelihood of a large-scale credit crunch in countries with high public debt, as well as by increased geopolitical risks. As a result, in 2021, risk premiums in global financial markets will rise for a long period of time and capital outflow will increase. Strong pro-inflationary risk will require a temporary considerable tightening of the monetary policy with a subsequent return to an accommodative monetary policy in the second half of the forecast period. Due to the large scale of the shock, inflation will stabilize at the target level slightly later than 2023. It should be noted that the inflation range in the risk scenario is narrower than last year. This is related to more stable dynamics of inflation expectations, which we are observing in 2022 and tend to extrapolate into the future. Once again, I shall reiterate that the current conditions and the nature of uncertainty around future economic dynamics are quite unusual. In these circumstances, clear communication policy and transparency of the central bank are becoming even more important. In order to respond to the challenges we're facing, we are taking a number of new measures. First, as you know, this year we have switched to holding press conferences of the governor after each key rate meeting. We believe that this widespread practice is very important to clarify both key rate decisions themselves and the evolution of the Board of Directors' assessment of the economic situation. Second, economic dynamics are showing increased inconsistency. This makes receiving information about the local situation in Russian regions even more important. Already in September, we are starting to publish information and analytical commentaries on inflation in every Russian region. This will enable people to learn about the specifics of price movements in their region specifically. In the first quarter of 2021, we are planning to start publishing a consolidated review of materials provided by the Bank of Russia main branches on the current economic situation in Russian regions. Finally, next year, we are planning to start publishing our forecast in a more detailed format, which will perhaps also include the forecast key rate path. In conclusion, I would like once again to express my opinion that the Russian economy has faced the pandemic with a much greater resilience reserve than ever and with a macroeconomic policy that is up to the challenges. After the shocks of 2014-15, we were able to take advantage of rather calm years to put our economy in order. And we need to remember this lesson. Good years must be used to replenish the safety cushions and the leeway for macroeconomic policy, without which counter-cyclical measures will be impossible. From a fiscal policy point of view, this means consolidated towards the fiscal rule parameters. In turn, from a monetary policy perspective, this means a return to a neutral policy as disinflationary risks are exhausted and inflation stabilizes close to our target level of 4%. As our analysis shows, inflation targeting policy can ensure this in various scenarios. Taken together, all these factors create a foundation for steady growth, as well as a predictable environment for households and businesses. Thank you for your time. I will be happy to answer your questions. And the first question, Elena Fabrichner, Reuters. The August inflation at 3.6% turned out to be within the framework of the expectations by the central bank or above the forecast. How the lack of the express overall deflation in August may affect the annual forecast by ECB. Do you expect inflation in September? As always, I should remember that the monthly forecast of inflation is what we do not do. The August inflation, in the form and shape that it came out, turned out to be approximately 0.1 of a percentage point above the consensus forecast, and whatever were expected by the weekly inflation, weekly price growth rates, respectively. We expect that, taking into account these data, inflation will probably be seen towards the end of the year within the middle of the range that we have defined in our last forecast, which is 4.7%. Andrei Birikov from Bloomberg. Good afternoon. Yes, good afternoon, Alexey Borisovich. A couple of more quick questions. When in 2021 it is possible to see the publishing of the rate trajectory in the beginning of the year or in the middle? And do I understand correctly that in your baseline scenario, switching to the neutral monetary policy, accommodative one, you said in the second half of the forecast timeline, which is not before the middle of 2022? And my third question, additional to my first one, the Fed currently allows for above target levels, being quite tolerant. Is the Russian central bank planning to also be quite tolerant towards this particular deviation from the target? Thank you. Based on the publication of our forecast, I would like to underscore that in the meantime, our internal discussions and debates with respect to the updating the format of the way that our forecast is going to be presented are continuing. We really have advanced quite strongly, but they are not yet complete, so we would not be able to identify more precise timing, but we expect that it may happen next year, and principally speaking, maybe before the end of this year. But in terms of any serious commitments is what we're not taking onto ourselves. Now, with respect to the key rate trajectory in the baseline scenarios, normalization of the policy, meaning the going back to the neutral rate, is going to be brought about by the aggregation of all of the conditions that may emerge, and we do anticipate that going back to the neutral policy may happen in the second half of the forecast period, towards the end of the forecast period. The policy shall become neutral, but at which point in time this process is going to kick in will strongly depend upon the data we are going to be receiving. And the third question, with regard to the Fed policy, that based on fact, Fed is going to try and provide its measures, letting the inflation above its long-term target throughout quite a lengthy period of time, based upon the documentation that we saw and the releases that we've been watching from the Fed over the past several weeks. In our case, this is not yet valid. Thank you. Anastasia Savelyeva from Interfax Agency. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. You are paying quite a lot of attention in your main guidelines to various potential of growth, because previously you assessed the Russian economy GDP potential at 1.52%. Has this thinking changed? Why are you not quoting any quantitative indicators with respect to the economic potential growth? First question. Second question, you were writing that changes in the hard currency and international reserves takes into account the Russian bank's gold acquisitions. Can this be interpreted in such a way that the Bank of Russia may resume gold acquisition, which was put on hold as of April 1st? If so, when? At least within which possible time frame, if you could tell us that. And my third question, you've been quite articulate in saying that you are planning to start publishing the trajectory of the key rate. What has changed? Have you finally found the kind of a format which enables you to do it? Because it was quite recently when the governor was quite cautious in speaking about this. Thank you. Thank you, Anastasia. With respect to the potential, the uncertainty towards the potential in the economic growth applies not only to the potential growth rates, not as much as the potential growth rates, rather than the level of potential GDP that may be negatively affected by structural changes of the supply factors related to the consequences of pandemic, which I have referred to in my presentation. The growth rates in the baseline scenario, I mean, the potential growth still remain at the same level, which is 1.5 to 2%. But in between scenarios, there are differences in terms of how deep and stable the fall of the potential level may be, which would affect the results of the forecast estimations, as well as the balance in the pro-inflationary and counter-inflationary risk in between these scenarios. Now, with respect to the expectations for the gold acquisition, one should understand that this is not the forecast by the Bank of Russia, because we are putting in a certain prerequisite which effectively extrapolates the average values of the previous years. There are no forward-thinking statements in as far as the gold currency transactions we're not doing, as you know, and when and if the decision is made to resume buying gold, the Bank of Russia will make a separate statement on that. And as far as the rate trajectory is concerned, we are specifically talking not only about the trajectory of the rate, but I would like to emphasize, but about a more detailed and comprehensive presentation of the forecast overall. Yes, these are the discussions that we've had for some time, for more than a year, and we've been able to advance in this discussion quite well. I'm not going to elaborate on it, but by July, there appeared an understanding that we are close to in one way or another, to execute this initiative, to launch it. And I would say that in terms of what has changed, and this is also a question about having considered quite a few options and basically have been able to feel out for something which, in an objective manner, enables us to quite comprehensively explain to our different audiences these very diverse views upon the forecast which emerges in the course of our key rate deliberations. And in the similar token, it is also related to the fact that the need for communicating the rate trajectory at this point in time and a more detailed presentation of the forecast at this point in time, the importance of it has grown because of a stronger uncertainty and the need for a more elaborate communication of our decision-making process. Anastasia Saprikina from RIA Novosti. What are the formats of the key rate publications the central bank is currently considering? We are considering, I shall say, our discussion format includes all of the approaches that other central banks are entertaining, and they are based upon the charts and the scenario analysis and the approaches which conditionally may be described as the dot plot analogs that Federal Reserve does, but what will be the ultimate decision, I'm not ready to tell you just yet. Roman Markelov, the Russian Gazette. When and under which circumstances the Bank of Russia may revert to a full cycle of tightening its monetary policy? The Bank of Russia will be going back to the neutral monetary policy when there emerges sufficient confidence that the inflation will stabilize at the 4% target level and shall remain at that point further. Dmitry Butrin, Kommersant. Which are the factors, do you believe, have played a pivotal role in having the central bank reduce the neutral range of the key rate? And what does central bank thinks of the neutral key rate long term? Is it going down or growing or remains stable? Well, the factors which were at play influencing this decision are going to be disclosed in our publication, and quite a serious consideration was the reduction of the global neutral rate, and I would say that a lower estimation of the country premium, the low level of the country premium. So all put together, that created approximately 100 basis points to reconsider the interval. And I believe the contribution from these both factors are almost equal from the point of view of further dynamics of the assessment of the neutral rate. This is going to be further specified based upon the way the economy is going to evolve, because we many times emphasize that the neutral rate estimates, they are quite approximate, even in the case of the economies which a much lengthier period in history of inflation targeting, as well as a stable level of price growth compared to Russia, and so respectively in order to authentically ascertain what is the level of the rate that would be able to guarantee ourselves the 4% inflation. For that purpose, we would require some additional time to elapse, and we would further revisit this in case the need appears based on the data we receive. Ivan Shligin for mag.ru. Good afternoon. We can't hear you. And now we are having somebody from the region asking, Igor Stepanov, expert Siberia magazine from the city of Magazine. It is quite detailed, so let me try and read it out. When defining the vector for a government monetary policy for 2020, it definitely must have been quite complicated to envisage the pandemic and some very serious economic consequences that followed. Could you tell us how effective the Bank of Russia's instruments turned out to be in terms of evening out the monetary policy course? Can one envisage such extraordinary risk like pandemic when defining the main guidelines for the monetary for 21, 22, and 2023? What kind of conclusion the Bank of Russia arrived at in the course of 2020? And can one say that the regulator has come to have an experience of a more expedient response to the economic processes in the environment, which is very close to the crisis one? Well, for the first part of the question, please tell us how effective the Banks of Russia instrument turned out to be. Well, to the extent we can see, the effects of the inflationary surge, which occurred in March and April, quite quickly exhausted themselves. Based on the data coming during the past several months, we can see that quite an even price evolution is amassing itself close to the 4% and even slightly lower than that. So we will further monitor it, and as I previously stated, the lag of the monetary policy decisions are quite considerably extended in time, so to be able to completely evaluate it is possible only after a considerable period of time goes by. But in the meantime, we believe that this 2020 tribulation in terms of our monetary policy, it has been really to withstand it with honor. Now, can one foresee such extraordinary risk when developing main guidelines for the 2021-2023? Well, basically speaking, that is what we're trying to do. And our risk scenario, yes, it doesn't describe directly what exactly is the risk that may manifest itself, but we anticipate certain set of prerequisites which will create stress kind of an environment which is even more serious compared to the shock which took place in the current year. This kind of a scenario analysis enables one to provide for the robust monetary policy and its resilience to different situations. Ivan Schlegin for Mark.ru. Alexey Borisovich, good afternoon. Recently, ruble and the oil has really crept back. How dangerous the situation is for the Russian economy, or principally speaking, it may not be so serious as it seems. Thank you very much for your question. It is true that the volatility in the oil market has increased recently because the oil price currently is about $40 per barrel, which is approximately the level of June, because we're too far away from the minimum levels which we remember noting in April and the beginning of May. And I would like to remind you that even in those circumstances, we were able to provide for the financial stability, and again, we're able to transmit that external shock into the inflation the way it transmitted. It was very much reserved. In terms of the ruble exchange rate fluctuation, it is a floating one. Currently, it floats within the range that we've been observing over the past 6 months. And so overall, this routine weakening of the ruble during the past 12 months is not strongly different and even a little bit lower than what happened in 2018. So again, from the point of view of any particular consequences for the economy or for the financial system, we do not see that, although without doubt we do take into account the exchange rate dynamics because there is a certain temporal transition and transmission of it into the short-term inflation. Anna Kaledina, Izvestia. In the main guidelines on the monetary policy for the next 3 years, we see an asymmetrical impact of the ruble upon inflation. Currently, it's a depreciation. In this case, this impact is stronger. Do you assess this in any way? This is the topic which we quite often and in a very detailed way comment, because you will find a paragraph about it in the monetary policy guidelines, a more elaborate assessment that you also may find upon the Bank of Russia website. But overall, this transitional effect with the exchange rate weakening, according to our estimates, is less than 0.1, less than 1% of inflation against the weakening of the ruble by 10%. At the same time, over the recent years, this transitional effect weakened and has been weakening. And so with the moderate exchange rate fluctuations, it is 0.6. With stronger ones, it is not very linear and may reach 0.1. Anna Andrianova, Bloomberg. Good afternoon. Alexey Borisovich, you said that the policy shall remain accommodative for quite some time. And what I'm curious to find out, during this form of it, can the rate go up? Because, principally speaking, if the inflation grows, then the rate should grow, but at the same time, the policy may remain accommodative. My second question is about the immediate future. I know that tomorrow you are going in for the week of silence, and I would like to know, do you already see some sort of a balance of risk? Maybe you would like to send some sort of a signal or give us some sort of a guideline, anything that you may tell us about this. Thank you very much. The first part of your question indeed is a very important one, because for the monetary policy being accommodative or quite a tightening one, that relates to the level of rate compared to the neutral one. But again, the softening or tightening the monetary policy is all about changing the rate in time. And indeed, before the policy turns into a neutral one, there will be a period during which it will be tightening, but remain accommodative. Now, in terms of the speed of it and the time frame within which it will happen, like I answered to some of the previous questions, it shall depend, without doubt, upon the way the situation evolves and the way this interplay between the demand and supply factors turns out in terms of the overall potential of our two-dimensional picture of the world, which we are trying to translate in our main guidelines. Now, the second part of a question that I understand it was impossible to avoid it, about the decisions that we are to make next Friday. In this case, our immediate premise has been worded in the presentation by the governor's statement made on Tuesday, and the board of directors will assess whether it will make sense further to reduce the rate or not. But at the same time, it would also take into account, amongst other things, the timing and the necessity of using the space within which the monetary policy can be softened, which we continue to see within the baseline scenarios, but again taking into account the incoming data about inflation and the slightly growing volatility in the external markets, where we'll weigh all of the drivers and choose the trajectory for the rate coming from the task of keeping the inflation close to 4%. Thank you. Olga Irtegova, Izvestia newspaper from Udmurtia region. When reducing the key rate, the attraction of deposit falls, but at the same time, the money of depositors makes up the foundations of the resource of the commercial banks. Depositors are important to the banks, and that is why the banks do maintain attractive terms, but at the same time, the consumer loan rates also remain high. And so in view of that, I have a question. What are the limits of the effectiveness of the monetary policy? To what extent the current rate level is close to the average weighted value? Thank you very much for a very important question, because it concerns several conceptual aspects of a monetary policy exercise. So I will start from the final bit. The average weighted value of the long-term rate is the neutral rate. If you act on an assumption that the inflation targeting policy reaches its target and brings inflation to the 4% level within the midterm outlook, then in the end of the day, after the period of the soft monetary policy, accommodative policy, we will come back to the neutral rate that the board of directors is currently assessing in exactly in the way that we went back to the neutral policy and then switched to the soft one, accommodative one, after after the period of the tightened policy, which was and has been in place since 2015, and then the accommodative and the tight one was since 2017 to the middle of the 2019. So coming back to the weighted average is coming back to the neutral policy, which takes place as the inflation falls back to its target ballpark. And that is exactly what the first part of the question is linked to, because the deposit rates are being defined not only by the key rate, but also by the term of such a deposit. So if we take a look at the structure of the interest rates, this is the bond market and the government securities, you can see that the structure of the interest rate is upwards looking, because the federal bond OZ profitability is higher longer term than the short-term maturity, which is specifically related to the fact that a rational expectation has been taken into account by the market that the key rate and the short-term rates eventually are going to be moving towards their long-term average weighted level. And so the attraction of the deposits under such circumstances is going to be supported by this upward curve. Moreover, that improves the relative attraction of more long-term deposits compared to short-term ones, and should bring about to the broadening of the offering in the savings, this infamous long-term money for financing investment projects. Thank you very much. Ekaterina Titova, senior editor of the Bank's Ros.ru portal from Nizhny Novgorod. Over the time of the pandemic, the over-credited debtors and borrowers are fewer. Does it mean that one should wait for a long time for low interest rate consumer loans like the case is in Europe? Well, honestly speaking, the relationship between the level of the key rate and the level of the borrowing rates with the level of the distressed debt is not direct. Yes, undoubtedly, when the economy is slowing down and the incomes are falling, definitely the banks will also demonstrate a certain worsening of their portfolios, including the consumer lending ones. But here it is important to remind us that over the past several years, the central bank very steadfastly pursued the policy of creating macro-prudential buffers, for capital, demanding from the banks to create greater reserves. To attain greater risk weights for certain categories of loans, for more riskier consumer loans, and currently the banks will be in a position to absorb this growth of the distressed debts with the help of the buffers that they have established. So the effect of the worsening of the credit quality of a portfolio upon the lending activity by the banks is going to be weaker, much weaker than what was the case during the crisis of 2014. And going back to the level of the key rates, in the consumer loan rates, one should admit that even in Europe, as well as in the United States, the target level of inflation is lower, and the rate is at 0 point, simply because the economy is encountering quite deep and strong problems, a much pronounced decline of the economy compared to what we had gone through based on the results of the second quarter. And under such circumstances, the central banks simply are forced to pursue a much more accommodative monetary policy, because the disinflationary risks are much stronger than in our case. Thank you very much. Rita Shpilevskaya, TASS agency. The governor one of the days stated that the structural shifts in the Russian economy because of the pandemic could affect the growth potential. What are the preliminary estimates the central bank may have? Well, I've already answered a similar kind of a question from the point of view of the potential GDP growth in the baseline scenario. We believe that the rates of the potential growth, they are the same ones as they have been before the pandemic, 1.5 to 2%, and that is what remains to be part of our baseline scenario. Whenever we are talking about the potential falling, we are talking about the level of potential GDP going into the decline, like the losses related to the structural changes in the economy. The subsidy subsequent growth will be demonstrating similar kinds of potential growth rates, but from a lower base. And so this low potential means that against the same level of demand in the economy, against the same level of GDP, the level of disinflationary impact from that downfall and the deviation of the inflation from the target is going to be smaller if the potential were to remain in the same level. So it is related not to the growth of potential, but the level of the potential GDP. So you would be able to see more details in the special paragraph that has been put into the main guidelines of the monetary policy, which we dedicated to this not a very straightforward topic. And the second question from Rita Shpilevskaya from TASS. Previously, you said that the GDP in Russia is going to be in the positive quarterly. What is the expectation of the central bank now? Well, the expectation of the central bank for the third quarter and the full year is going to be updated in the October forecast round. I believe that the third quarter is something that we so far haven't yet described. But indeed, there is a stronger belief that in terms of the sequential growth in the seasonal event-out denomination, the third quarter compared to the second one will demonstrate a positive dynamic despite the limitations that we are familiar with in OPEC+. Anastasia Savelyeva from Interfax. Good afternoon again. Yes, I've got two questions that I need to finish off. The first one is specifically the forthcoming Board of Directors key rate meeting. Would you be able to tell us, in view of all of what you've told us, how strong is the probability that during that Board of Directors may take a pause, and bearing in mind what you've stated, that the potential of the rate reduction has practically been exhausted? But if the Board of Directors is to consider the further reduction, will it be considering the 50 basis points approach if we're talking only about a small step, which will be worth 0.25? And the second question my other colleagues raised about the ruble exchange rate, you stated that the consequences for the economy from its weakening in September, October is something that you do not really believe in. But could you assess how tangible is the change in the disinflationary risk balance? Have the pro-inflationary risk grown and have the disinflationary one gone down? Thank you very much. About the forthcoming meeting, in terms of probability, we are on the eve of the meeting, and even after it, we are not hypothesizing. I believe that the Board of Directors will consider different alternatives, different solutions, as well as different signals that would merge themselves by the time we make up our mind. And in terms of the space for further key rate reduction, I would like to emphasize that based on the results of the July meeting, the opinion of the Board of Directors was that the potential for softening the monetary policy in the baseline scenario remains. And at the current point in time, we believe that, yes, we should do it in terms of a very deliberate approach to whether we should use this potential, but this particular opportunity still sustains. And with regards to a second question, that is about the balance of the pro-inflationary and disinflationary risks, the views for 2021 that the balance of risks is shifted towards counter-inflationary risks which prevail, but what we observe is that the current inflation in the meantime is slowing down, not slightly slower, not as fast as was expected, meaning to say that this disinflationary risk coming through being short-term is being shifted to the right, but the general opinion for the next year is that counter-inflationary risks are prevailing. Elena Fabriczna, Reuters. The 185 billion rubles sale to the market will start as of October 1st? Question mark. Yes, there are no changes to the communication that we came out with back in July. And so, continuing this netted sales, which remained as the result of the offsetting of the deferred acquisitions in 2018, and the currency sales related to the split of these bank shares, as well as the additional transactions which were conducted in March and April, which is 185 billion. And we are going to sell the respective amount of currency in equal portions daily, starting from October 1st until December 31st this year. Evgenia Pismennaya, Bloomberg. How do you explain the reduction of the share of non-residents' participation in the OFZ auctions? Is central bank not concerned by it? If this share further goes down, how this may affect the market? Well, the explanations can be very different. Overall, if you take a look at the participation of the foreign investors and the flows of the portfolio investment into the debt markets of very different countries, with the emerging markets over the past several months, these flows have weakened, and most apparently that can be explained by a very reserved attitude towards risk after the initial recovery of the appetites in May and June. This is something that doesn't give us any concerns, simply because, as we see, the auctions are taking place, and I would say demonstrating some record levels, because there is demand for the government debt from the Russian investors. Thank you. Anna Turikova, the Urals Business Consulting. To what extent the excessive weakening or appreciation of the Russian ruble is dangerous as opposed to the main currencies? How the Bank of Russia is planning to maintain this balance at the same time trying to uphold the traction of the Russian currency for the global players? Let me repeat yet again that the ruble exchange rate, since the end of the 2014, is fully floating, and consequently its dynamics is being defined by quite a number of drivers. Moreover, and this is important to underscore, that the fluctuations of the exchange rates is an important precaution, safety valve, which enables one to limit the impact from the changing external environment upon the Russian economy, and that is the core reason as to why the decision was made to switch over to the floating exchange rate in the course of the past 5 years of this policy being pursued. 6 years, I would say. This policy has proven itself to be quite an effective instrument. Without doubt, if the fluctuations of the exchange rate reach the scale which creates a threat to the financial stability, then the central bank retains the right to restrict these fluctuations by using the tool set for financial stability measures. But overall, this is a floating exchange rate, and we do take into account its dynamics when formulating our opinions with respect to the monetary policy, with respect to selecting the key rate trajectory, amongst other things. But we do assess it and view it as an independent from changes. Tatiana Chubasova from Interfax. Does the central bank put into its scenario for 2020-2021 the strengthening of the sanctions towards Russia because of the events in the Belarus, because of the US and European rhetoric with regards to the Navalny case? Well, let me put it this way. In our baseline scenarios, changes of the sanctional regime are not part of the prerequisite set. In the risk scenario, yes, we do anticipate the geopolitical risks to become more acute with the possible strengthening of the sanctions and with an additional outflow of capital as the result of it. Anna Kaledina, Izvestia. In the course of the week, there have been serious appeals towards introducing into Russia the base income, a statement made by the senators like Dmitry Medvedev and others. To what extent this step may affect the inflation and the monetary policy? Well, without doubt, in a very significant way, we do take into account the fiscal policy by the government of Russia. when putting together our forecast and when deciding upon the monetary policy measures, but we stem from the decision that has already been made rather than the ones that hypothetically are being discussed. And with this in mind, I should say that I would be able to answer this question if and when respective decisions are made. Evgeny Belyakov, Komsomolskaya Pravda. What sense does it make to reduce the key rate if it doesn't lead to the reduction of the real interest rates and as far as the consumer loans are concerned anyway? As a result, the super profit the banks are getting, the deposits are becoming cheaper, but the loans remain as expensive as they have been. Well, consumer loans are not the only loans which are being used in the economy. Principally speaking, the loans are not that ultimate offer of a credit resources. There are other segments within the financial system, and specifically a very quickly broadening bond market and other parts of the capital market. But this is just a general comment. I would allow myself to disagree with this statement that the reduction of the key rate doesn't lead to the reduction of the real interest rates. We do acknowledge that since the beginning of this year, there occurred quite a considerable reduction of rates, both in retail lending, specifically in mortgage lending, as well as in consumer lending. There was some reduction as well as in the business loans. So from the point of view of our inflation target being 4%, and it doesn't change, the reduction of nominal rates directly reduces the real rates, particularly in as far as the material term loans are concerned. That was our last question. Thank you very much for your attention, and very much for very appropriate and very important questions. And I do hope that you will have an opportunity to familiarize yourselves in detail with the text of the main guidelines of the monetary policy over the next days and weeks. And we will be in a position to provide you with additional comments and explanations in the course of considering the guidelines of the monetary policy discussion in the Russian Parliament. Thank you very much.